This program contains copyrighted material that may be used for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research under the provisions of Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. All rights to the copyrighted material used in this program are reserved to their respective owners.
Hello and welcome to A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. I'm your host, Blessings Wynn. My guest today is Davie John Garcia. Raised amidst spiritual uncertainty, his quest became one of seeking truth. Welcome, Davie. I'm so glad you made it here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a privilege to be here.
Again, you have such an amazing testimony. Can we start with telling our audience about your spiritual upbringing?
Sure. So my upbringing is a little unusual, because on one side of my family, it's more typical in the sense that they're largely raised Catholic, with a lot of them converting to evangelical Christianity in the late 80s and early 90s. And where I grew up in San Antonio, there was a very big evangelical movement in the 90s. It was the church, the Cornerstone Church with Pastor John Hagee became very huge back then. And so one side of my family got very much into that, and the other side of my family was very different. And
how so?
That side of my family was very, very involved in the occult. And my grandmother was a witch, and my family has a lot of memories of her casting spells, engaged in rituals. She always believed that there were evil spirits in the house and that there were demons, and she would be engaged in things like black candle magic to try and banish these spirits. And my mother was forced to participate in that. And so that was my grandmother. And my grandfather was no less strange. He was a 33rd degree Freemason.
I see.
But he never talked about it. He was very secretive.
Were there things that he did that kind of tipped you off to his spiritual leaning, or?
Well, he never liked to talk about spirituality at all. If you try to talk about it with him, he would shut off the conversation. He didn't like to talk about it. But we knew that he was involved in something, and then we remember his clothing that he would wear. He would often go out wearing a black apron with a skull and crossbones on it, and he had this crimson fez that he would wear with a gold tassel, and it had two crossed swords emblazoned in the middle. And so we remember that, but I never really thought anything about that as a child. And really, we didn't know how involved he was into it until after he died, actually.
So how did that occur for you? What was the process of discovery?
Well, I didn't find out until reading his obituary, because he put it in his obituary that he was a 33rd degree Freemason, and they even included his titles, which were Knight of the Rose Cross and Prince of the Royal Secret.
Now, for members of our audience who are unfamiliar with what a Freemasonry is, could you give a little detail about that?
Sure. It's to most people, it's considered as just kind of a secular old boys club where like-minded men who are concerned with bettering themselves or improving themselves like to come together and engage in charitable works. They'll usually do like fundraisers for children's hospitals, things like this. So that's kind of the outward veneer. They hang out, they have like a brotherhood together where they have like a camaraderie, and they go to each other for wisdom and mentorship and advice. But then there's a mystical element to it as well, and they accept you if you can believe in any God. They don't care what God you believe in, but you have to believe in something. You can't be an atheist and be a Freemason. So
you mentioned 33rd degree. So there's levels to this membership.
Yes.
And what is that significant of like what is 33rd degree?
Now I know that my grandfather's title was Knight of the Rose Cross and Prince of the Royal Secret, and honestly, I don't know what he had to do to obtain that rank, but it's a very high rank. It's either at the top or near the top.
Okay.
And it kind of has it borrows from like ancient mystery school religions where they kind of reveal truth to you, or their version of truth, as you ascend up these rankings, and they have their own secretive process of allowing you deeper into the fold. Where if you're I'm sure if people who are involved in Freemasonry might be listening to this, and they might think, oh, well, that's nonsense. We don't do any of that stuff. There's nothing like that. But at the lower levels, it's not.
It's not, right?
At lower levels, they don't really discuss things like this. There might be some vague spiritual inclinations or words that get shared, but it's mostly, like I said earlier, where it's, fundraising, charitable works, camaraderie, but the further you ascend up the ranks, the more spiritual it gets.
Okay.
The more you're taking oaths, and you're getting more involved in the mysticism aspect of it.
So how did all of this affect you?
Well,
like spiritually speaking.
Well, at the time, my grandfather died when I was very young, and so I didn't really know about any of this, but he would always he would say strange things, and he would say things that would later come true, and he wouldn't really think anything of it. It would just be some remark like I know this is going to happen, and then it would always happen. And I just always knew my grandfather had it felt like a sixth sense to kind of know when something important was going to happen, and the biggest part of that was, it's kind of morbid, but he always told me that he knew he would die before my 8th birthday, and he did.
And so happened.
And he did.
So you also mentioned your mother was into witchcraft, and how did that manifest for you? Was there any repercussions or?
Well, my grandmother was into witchcraft, and I never even knew her. She's kind of a very mysterious figure in my family. She ran out on the family when even my mom was still very young. And so my mother doesn't really remember a whole lot from her, just like these vague memories of like witchcraft and these weird things always happening in the house. And she was a very emotionally disturbed, chaotic kind of a woman. And she was very into witchcraft. And I'm not sure what flavor of witchcraft that she got that from, or even where that came from. But I never met them, but her sisters were also involved in things like that. And one day she just disappeared, and then no one ever saw her again. She just left. Where my mother had actually, somehow, she had a very loose understanding of God. And she wasn't really into witchcraft, really, not my mother, but by the time my parents had me, there was sort of a thin veneer of Christianity in the home. And because my mother was very like, I don't know what to believe.
Right.
And then my father came from a very vaguely, quasi-Christian background, where if you asked them if they were Christian, they'd say yes. But if you
Was
actually,
it like Catholicism or?
Well, my father and his family were raised Catholic, but then they became Protestants later on, like in the 80s and 90s, they became Protestants. And if you asked them if they were Christian, they'd say yes, but if you asked them about, the Bible or any doctrine, they wouldn't really know.
They're
what to tell
largely
you.
ignorant.
Yeah, they would say, well, you get into heaven by being a good person, or, they had very, very vague understanding of Christianity, so it was just kind of a thin veneer in the household. But growing up, there was always strange happenings in the house and in the home, and it kind of opened the door to this occult energy, and it's kind of what opened the door for my later interest into the occult as well.
So were there apparitions? What was happening in the home?
Yeah, back then, we were convinced that our house was haunted, and because it really did feel very much like a horror movie, and it really kicked off after my grandfather died, and I I didn't know why that was. No one really, I don't know if we really made that connection with that, but I remember that was the case where we would see things that weren't there. You know, we would see apparitions or ghosts. We didn't really know what they were, but we would see beings in the home, and we would always hear things being knocked over in the middle of the night. We would feel like people tugging on our hair, even pushing us down the stairs, and even feeling like something crawling into bed with us at night. And me and my mother in particular, we were particularly sensitive to it. My father did as well, not to the extent that me and my mother did, but all of us were affected by it.
Affected. So did you find yourself now being somewhat comfortable with this awkward or supernatural kind of oppressive environment? And if so, did you start to seek it out or try to make sense of it?
That's an interesting question. At first I was terrified of it. You know, I think that the natural human inclination is to feel terror when you're encountering, you know, things of this nature. But at the time I didn't know what it was, and you know, I didn't have like a Christian foundation with which to explain these things or to find solace from these things or anything like that. So I was kind of on my own, and at the time when these things were first happening, I was terrified of them, but I became very curious as to what these things actually are. And so I decided I would ask my friends about it, and I'd have conversations with my friends. And I had a couple friends that they had stories, maybe if something happened to a family member. But I had a friend of mine in particular named Paul who experienced very similar things in his home. And so we developed kind of a friendship and like a kinship over these strange spiritual happenings in our home. We both shared that. And I decided to look further into it. And I decided to go online and just look it up. And I found out there was like whole communities of people that were in like these paranormal communities of people who were sharing stories about what had happened, what they experienced, you know, whether these stories are true or not, who knows. But I remember reading these stories. I'd be on these websites where they'd share all these photographs of, you know, supposed apparitions that they had caught on camera. And all these things became really interesting to me. I developed like this fascination by it. And I would listen to, you know, these different people's takes on what was happening. And, you know, some people had very pagan or, you know, occult, new age takes on what it was that was happening.
Right.
And it turned into a very strong fascination.
So you're starting to feel validated by your own home environment and the spiritual environment that's going on there. What then did you start to do? Did you join these communities? How did you express this curiosity that you had?
Yeah, I would participate in these communities online, and I was really interested in trying to interact with these beings. And as time went on, as it became more normal, as they were just kind of infesting my home, I developed a stronger interest in wanting to actually try to contact them. And because I became less afraid since they were all around me all the time, it's overexposure to it, I suppose. And all of this started happening around the time I was going through puberty. I was like 12, 13 years old. I was a teenager. And at the time, you know, as a result of maybe the dark forces in the home and puberty and other things going on, I became very depressed and morose and very emotionally unstable and unhealthy. And all these things kind of came together to turn into another interest of mine, which was dark, heavy music. And I got very into dark, heavy music. And the further I got into that music, that music started to glorify things like witchcraft and the occult and Satanism and all these things. And it increased that fascination. It was like a perfect storm, because I got attracted to that music because I was depressed and sad. And then it happened to be glorifying the very thing I was also fascinated by over here. And so these things kind of came together, and I formed a whole personality around this music and the paranormal and the occult. And that's when I really got deep into it, and I wanted to seek these things out further.
So as you became a practitioner, did you start to develop special gifts? Anything like that happen for you?
I wouldn't know if I wouldn't call it a gift, but I was just I began to become very unafraid of these things. And so I got into things like spell books and Ouija boards and tarot cards and all of this occult paraphernalia. And really, it all started out kind of as play. You know, like I would learn about tarot cards and I would just try it out. And if I got a reading that ended up foretelling something or gave me a deeper insight into something, it was very interesting. Like, oh wow, it worked. It's actually worked. And you know, if I was using a Ouija board and then it actually starts to move on its own, it's like, oh wow, like it's actually working. Like there's something going on here.
So some people would argue that it's basically just a magnet.
Right. I've heard that before.
But describe to us, what is it like operating a Ouija board?
Well, there's no magnets in it. It's really, depending on what you're using, it's either a piece of cardboard, which I remember you could find these things at Toys R Us, which is crazy.
Right, I saw some at Target, I was shocked.
Yeah, they have them at Barnes & Noble and places like that still, but the older versions of these, because they've been mass produced by big companies for a long time, but the older ones are just a piece of wood and a pointer, which is also wood. And the surface of the Ouija board, it's very glossy, so it's easy to glide the pointer around. And the Ouija board will have all the letters of the alphabet, and the pointer will be spelling out words and symbols to give you a reading or a meaning. So the idea is that there's a spirit that's using the board to communicate with you, and it's taking control of the pointer and guiding it to the different letters to spell out a message to you. And when you're using it, sometimes it doesn't work, right? For some people, it doesn't work at all. But when it does work, it's kind of like this electricity fills the room, and everyone gets excited. Like everyone's like looking at each other. Are you moving it? Are you moving it? Like there's that kind of excitement and feeling in the air of like, is this really happening right now, or is someone messing with us?
Right.
But there's no magnets in it. I'm sure some people will mess with people and just take control over it. But from my experience, it really did move of its own accord, because you want to very lightly touch it to where you're not guiding it. You're just lightly placing your fingers on it, and it moves itself.
So it's like an animated automaticity to it.
Yes.
Nothing that you are doing.
Correct.
So you're certain that there is a spiritual force behind it that's propagating it.
Yes. And
so once you're exploring this, does this start to shift things that are happening in your life?
It does, in the sense that I got really into the divination aspect, the communication with these beings, and as I did, it really started to turn into this whole worldview that I had. Because as I would communicate, at first I thought I was maybe communicating with ghosts or the spirits of maybe the dead or things like that, but these beings were starting to spell out messages to me, and it was mostly me and my friend Paul that would do this. We would do it together, and it would spell out messages to us, and it was kind of revealing to us that it wasn't like the spirit of a dead person, but it was this like transcendent being, like a god, that was communicating with us through this board. And it kind of excited our imagination that there's this whole world that we know nothing about, but we have the privilege of having like a glimpse into this secret truth, this secret spiritual underworld that previously we had known nothing about, and that most people knew nothing about. And so it was very exciting. It was kind of the feeling of, if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, it's kind of like seeing like we're living in a matrix, and kind of seeing that there's this real truth behind that. And as we communicated with these beings, it started leading us down that path, and it wildly shaped our worldview.
So let's talk about how you found your way out. Like, how did that come to be?
Well, me and my friend were heavily into it. We were in a metal band at the time, and all of those things all came together. The music and the occultism really went hand in hand. And so as I continued to progress in these systems and communicate with these beings, it was also precipitated with the rise of my success as a musician. And so all of these things were coming together. So of my own accord, I never would have looked back from it. And it seemed like this was all leading somewhere, like somewhere that I was meant to be. And it really wasn't until the tragic death of my friend that...
Is this Paul?
Paul, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And
sorry to hear that.
thank you. He ended up committing suicide, and it was very shocking. It was very shocking. Sometimes he would joke about it, because we had a very dark sense of humor, but I never actually thought that he would, and it never seemed clear to me that he was even considering doing something like that. But he did, and the last thing that he did before he died was he posted a clip of us performing, and he just said good night, and that was it. And then he took his life, and that greatly affected me. That greatly affected me. It's almost like this connection that I had, this covenant, this connection that I had with this dark spiritual force was severed in that moment. And it's not that I didn't throw away my guitar or my spiritual paraphernalia. I didn't throw it away or anything like that, but... You
felt disconnected in some kind of way.
I just didn't want to participate in it anymore. It's like something left.
The infatuation kind of just broke. The spell almost broke.
Yeah. That's probably a good way of putting it. It's like a spell was broken, and I was the honeymoon phase of that was over, and I became a lot less infatuated with it, and that's really what began my walking away from that spiritual path.
So I'm a bit familiar with your testimony, and I know that you started researching how to improve your sense of literature, writing.
Right.
Let's talk about how you found the Bible.
Right. Well, the Bible was always interesting to me because, in the occultism that I was interested in, I had read all of some of these occult texts and some of these apocryphal texts and Gnostic gospels like the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Judas. And those things made the Bible really interesting to me in the sense that I didn't believe the Bible was true, but I believed that the Bible and other religions, all these other spiritual systems had an exoteric knowledge that wasn't really true, but it was a gateway for those who were able to discern into a deeper truth.
I see.
And so the Bible was interesting to me, but I thought it was a superficial level of knowledge, and it wasn't the truth. Mm-hmm. It was just a potential gateway into the truth, but you could have done that through the Bhagavad Gita or whatever else. So
right.
It was just an interesting spiritual book to me. And it wasn't until later on in my life where I developed all of these different secular interests. And like you mentioned, I was very into literature. Mm-hmm. I always loved to read, and I loved literature, especially classic literature. And I wasn't really interested in going to school and studying it. I just wanted to be a well-read person. And so I was just looking into what I could do to study literature on my own, to develop a greater appreciation of these great books. And so I started looking into, well, how do I start? How do I begin a study of literature? And I learned that literature, it's very chronological. It all builds upon itself. So you can't fully understand Shakespeare without understanding Dante, and you can't fully understand Dante without understanding Homer. It's all chronological, and you should start with the very first book.
And which book was that?
And the very first book happens to be the Bible.
And what effect did that have when you started researching and reading it?
You know, I never,
as a Gnostic,
right,
unbeliever.
I never would have thought that. I never would have thought that the Bible was the first book, but it's literally the first book, like with 2 covers and a binding and pages in the middle. Like that
But
was
spiritually, what effect did it have on you?
Spiritually, well, at the time, I thought it was interesting. I thought it was curious, and because I didn't immediately start reading the Bible when I learned that. I just kind of put a pin in it, and I thought that's interesting. And the Bible just kind of kept coming up in other areas of my life as well. And as the Bible just kind of kept coming up in these other secular interests I had, I felt that something was telling me, like, you should read the Bible. Like, it's time to read this book. And so I thought, okay, let's see if there's something to this strange old book after all. And so I just started flicking through it, and I opened it up to the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John, it starts with that, it's kind of like a poem that starts off the book, where in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. It starts off with that, and I remember reading that, and for some reason I didn't understand it. Like, I didn't intellectually understand it, but something like resonated in my heart and told me that this is true.
Praise God.
Like, it pierced at the core of something that felt real and true and eternal, even though I didn't really understand it. And I was surprised that it made me feel that way. I'd never read something, because I had read all these, all these books, all these dark, weird, spiritual books. And this was the first time that I felt unequivocally, without anyone else telling me, that something about this is hinting at actual truth.
So we're running out of time. This is a great place to stop. Why don't you give our audience a sneak peek of what we'll be talking about in the next episode?
Next time we'll be exploring a little bit further of the religion behind heavy metal music.
Intriguing. Thank you to our audience at home for joining us. Know that God has not left you defenseless against the devil's deceptions. He has given you his love letter, a human manual known as the Holy Bible. We can always test the spirit of any practice against his word. Isaiah 8:20 reminds us, to the law and to the testimony, if they speak not according to these words, it is because there is no light in them. Christ alone can set you free, free indeed, from a wolf in sheep's clothing.